All right. So now that we've looked at supply, we've looked at demand, and we figured out that these two curves show us the relationship between price and quantity supplied and price and quantity demanded. However, the question still stands as to where on the curve the market would operate. And by the term market itself, it refers to not just demand or supply, but both acting um, simultaneously. Uh, so to figure out where exactly you're going to operate, you you take into account both the demand and supply conditions of the market, uh, which gives you this is equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity, and equilibrium price, and this particular point is something we call equilibrium. Now, if you look at equilibrium in little more detail, so let's look at equilibrium. Um, Now, obviously, this is the point where demand is equal to supply. You can see that much from the diagram itself. But its proper definition, uh, which unfortunately a lot of people don't pay heed to, although it is required if you get a question on this. The definition is how equilibrium is a point of rest. That is, it has no tendency to change, obviously, provided that demand and supply conditions do not change. So unless the demand and supply conditions of the demand or supply conditions of the market do not change, that is, they don't shift or increase or decrease, the idea is you will continue to operate at the equilibrium point. And because demand is equal to supply at this particular point, markets this is the point where the market clears, which basically means there are no shortages, no surpluses, because the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. So that was the basic idea of the market, and where you're going to operate there. So now let's look at some cases where we have a few shifts and how that leads to uh, the formation of the new equilibrium point. All right. So shifts. So let's take case one where supply increases. Supply increases. It could be due to any reasons, any of the reasons that we studied before. Any of the factors that affect supply could be a decrease in cost of production. So the wage rate of labor could have gone down. Any whatever. So you have price, you have quantity, you have demand, you have supply, right? All right. And you need to show a new supply curve, and supply and demand, they both increase by a rightward shift. So that's how you're going to do so. However, don't directly jump to the new equilibrium point. Admittedly, the old one was here where you had this particular quantity and you had this particular price. However, uh, if there's a while you normally can just jump to the new point, which is basically going to be where um sorry yeah basically going to be this, where the new supply curve intersects the um what do you call it, the old demand curve. So this is E, this is going to be um E1. However, if you have a question particularly about this, you have to show a bit more detail. So what you do in all of these cases, as we'll see, you go with the original price, market price, and you see how that intersects the new supply curve. You call this quantity supplied because that's where price and so the supply curve are intersecting, right? And if you really look at it, you can, uh, for all intents and purposes, erase the old supply curve. It's just redundant. You're not going to erase it in the actual paper, but just to help you visualize. So now the only relevance of the old point of equilibrium is where the price is cutting the demand curve, which means this is quantity demanded, right? We're ignoring the old supply curve. We don't care about that anymore. So you have a case where quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, meaning producers are willing to supply more quantity that consumers are willing to buy, which leads to a surplus, right? If you do have a surplus, to to remove the surplus because you have an excess stock, बिक नहीं रहा है, like लोग खरीद नहीं रहे, the idea is you want to make it cheaper, you want to reduce price, which is what the producer will do. So you reduce price in order to ensure that market clears, right? What happens as you reduce price? Now if you remember the law of demand and supply, if you reduce price, quantity demanded should increase because there's an inverse relationship. However, quantity supplied should decrease because there was a direct relationship between price and quantity supplied. And if you look towards the diagram, that's pretty much what happens. As price reduces, the quantity demanded increases, but the quantity supplied decreases. Eventually you get to this particular point where quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied, which is your new equilibrium price P1, and you get your equilibrium quantity Q, right? So you can show it. So if you do get a question about this, you are expected to initially show the surplus and then go forth. If we take another case, and let's take a case where you will be facing let's say shortage. Obviously there are possible four cases where supply increases, it decreases, demand decreases. But I'll just do the cases where supply and demand both, I mean, like one case where supply has increased, one case where demand increases, because that will just give you an idea. You can just flip it around for the opposite of that particular case. Okay, so demand increases, it could happen due to any reason, disposable income increases, the price of a substitute increases, or the price of a complement falls, whatever. So if we draw and a demand supply diagram, price and quantity, you have demand, you have supply. Demand increases like supply to the right. Sahi. And if you remember, we're not okay. Let's just first draw the old equilibrium, price and quantity. And again, if the question isn't irrelevant to this particular diagram, or they haven't explicitly told you to draw a diagram, you can just directly show a change from this equilibrium to this equilibrium. However, if the question is about the price mechanism or change, or they've asked you to show what effect an increase in, if the question has asked you to explain the effect of a decrease in income tax, let's say, on the market, then using with the help of a demand and supply diagram, then obviously you're supposed to draw a diagram which has more depth. So what we're going to do is you're going to hold the same price level, because prices don't change right away, right? Something has to happen. And basically what you can do, you can erase the old demand curve, you don't need it anymore. And if you see here, so this price, it intersects the new demand curve here. So this is going to be quantity demanded. Intersects the supply curve here, quantity supplied. We're not looking at the old demand curve, so for us it doesn't really exist anymore. And as we've seen, now this creates a case where you're demanding more units than you have, so that's a shortage. And to eradicate a shortage, what you basically do is that you increase price. You increase price. So obviously what happens, quantity demanded decreases and quantity supplied increases, because law of supply, law of demand. And in fact, interestingly, so what this function of prices is called a lot of the time is the rationing function. Rationing, because the idea is you have scarce what do you call it, units. So you just increase price and hence ration them out that way. So that's a very important mechanism of price, of the price mechanism, that is the rationing function. Okay, so as you increase price, the quantity demanded should decrease. As you increase price, the quantity supplied should increase. Eventually ends up giving you new equilibrium price P1, new equilibrium quantity Q1. This is your new equilibrium E1. That's the basic idea of shifts and how, um, what do you call it? Yeah, and how you get a new equilibrium. Another function of price that we can illustrate here. So one was how it rations out scarce units. Another function of price is the signaling function. So how it signals and communicates with, usually with the producers, but even with the consumers in cases. So if you look here, you have an increase in price, and the reason for this increase in price is an increase in demand, right? So demand, basically it shifted to the right, which led to an increase in price. This acted as a signal, one could say, a signal to producers to produce more, to extend their supply, to increase quantity supplied, right? So we just took it for granted in the law of supply that as price increases, quantity supply increases. And admittedly, we don't have to go into a lot of depth in that, but we can call this the signaling function, where through changes in price, it communicates with the producers as to how to change their quantity. So this is really called the signaling function of the price mechanism. Some The only function that I've seen in the past papers in MCQs, that's it, is the rationing function. So just be sure you have a good hold on that, but no harm in knowing in another function as well.